When you begin to understand human behavior deeply, you realize something quiet yet absolute. People do not calculate your worth through your words. They calculate it through your patterns, through what you allow to repeat, through what you forgive too quickly, through what you ignore when it clearly deserves a response. Your life is always speaking, even when your mouth is silent. There are behaviors that do not announce your value loudly. They do something more powerful. They train others how to perceive you. And once you understand this, you stop living emotionally reactive, and you begin living intentionally aligned. The first behavior is the way you respond or refuse to over-respond. A person who constantly explains themselves is often perceived as uncertain, but a person who speaks clearly once, and then allows silence to reinforce their position, begins to carry authority. Not the authority of domination, but the authority of clarity. When you stop chasing understanding from people who are committed to misunderstanding you, your energy returns to you. And that return is what others feel as presence. The second behavior is the power of boundaries that do not bend under emotional pressure. Anyone can set a boundary when they are calm. But your worth is revealed when someone tests that boundary with guilt, urgency, or manipulation and you remain unchanged. You do not argue your boundary into existence. You simply maintain it. And in that maintenance, people learn that your word is not decorative, it is structural. The third behavior is selective availability. A life that is always accessible becomes a life that is undervalued. Not because you are less, but because you are everywhere. When you become intentional about access, who gets your time, who gets your attention, who gets your emotional presence, you begin to shift perception without saying a word. Scarcity here is not gamesmanship. It is respect for your own energy, and what is respected internally is eventually respected externally. The fourth behavior is emotional regulation under provocation. Anyone can be calm when life is gentle, but your real value becomes visible when tension rises and you do not lose yourself. You do not react from wounds, you respond from awareness. You do not escalate chaos, you absorb it, process it, and choose clarity instead. This is not suppression, this is mastery. And people instinctively trust those who are not ruled by their emotional impulses. The fifth behavior is refusal to over-explain your no. A weak no tries to justify itself. A strong no stands complete on its own. Every time you over-explain your limits, you unconsciously signal that your boundary is negotiable. But when your no is clean, calm, and final, something shifts. People may not always like it, but they begin to respect it, because they realize you are not persuadable through pressure. The sixth behavior is consistency in identity. Many people perform strength in moments of inspiration, but abandon it in moments of fatigue. But worth is not built in peaks, it is built in repetition. When your standards remain the same across moods, environments, and seasons, people stop testing you. Consistency creates predictability, and predictability creates trust. And trust, in human perception, is one of the highest currencies of value. The seventh behavior is quiet self-prioritization, not selfishness, not neglect of others, but the refusal to abandon yourself in order to maintain access, approval, or temporary harmony. When you consistently choose yourself in small decisions or rest, your peace, your time, your energy, you begin to teach the world that you are not disposable. And people treat as valuable what you treat as non-negotiable. Over time, these behaviors begin to merge. You become someone who does not need to announce their worth. You embody it. You do not argue for respect. You become the standard that defines it. And something interesting happens when you reach this state. People begin to adjust themselves around you without being told. You stop chasing validation because your life no longer leaks uncertainty. You stop overgiving because your energy is no longer unregulated. You stop explaining your value because your presence communicates it clearly. And perhaps the deepest truth is this: people do not actually respond to your words as much as they respond to how grounded you are when you say them. When your behavior is aligned with self-respect, even your silence becomes instructive. Even your absence becomes educational. There is a quiet dignity in no longer overextending to be understood. There is a deeper peace in no longer negotiating your worth with people who benefit from your self-doubt. And there is a certain spiritual clarity that arrives when you realize that your life does not need to be louder, it needs to be cleaner. Because in the end, your worth was never something you had to prove. It was something you had to stop abandoning. Expand KEY.1 in 600 words with OUT heading. When you look closely at human behavior, you realize that people are rarely measuring your worth through your explanations. They are not carefully analyzing your intentions or decoding your inner emotions. Instead, they are watching something far more honest: your patterns of response. And among all patterns, the most revealing one is this: how you respond when you are challenged, misunderstood, or ignored. There is a subtle difference between being understood and being perceived as valuable. Many people try to earn understanding through over-explaining themselves. They repeat their intentions, clarify their emotions, defend their choices, and hope that eventually, clarity will create respect. But life rarely works that way. In reality, excessive explanation often weakens presence. It shifts your energy from grounded certainty into emotional negotiation. And once you enter negotiation with your own boundaries, people begin to sense that your position is not firm. Silence, when used consciously, carries a different kind of authority. Not the silence of avoidance, not the silence of suppression, but the silence of completion. When you speak clearly once without emotional excess and then allow space to exist without chasing validation, something powerful happens. You are no longer feeding confusion with more words. You are allowing clarity to settle on its own. And clarity, when unforced, becomes stronger than persuasion. Think about how human psychology works in subtle interactions. When someone repeats themselves too much, the listener unconsciously assumes uncertainty. Not because the message is wrong, but because repetition signals internal instability. On the other hand, when someone speaks with calm finality and does not return to defend their statement, the mind registers it as resolved. Resolution creates perception of strength. And strength, whether emotional or verbal, naturally attracts attention and respect. This is why over-explaining becomes dangerous to self-worth. It slowly teaches others that your position can be shifted if enough emotional pressure is applied. Even if that was never your intention, behavior speaks louder than intention. Each extra explanation becomes a quiet signal that your boundary is still open for negotiation. And once that signal is established, people begin to test it, not always consciously, but instinctively. There is also something deeper happening internally when you stop over-explaining. You begin to reclaim your emotional energy. Every unnecessary explanation is not just words, it is an emotional leak. It is energy spent trying to manage perception instead of maintaining presence. When you stop that cycle, your attention returns to your own center. And from that center, your responses become cleaner, more intentional, and more aligned with truth rather than reaction. The most grounded individuals are not those who speak the most convincingly, but those who do not feel the need to continuously defend what is already clear to them. They understand that truth does not require constant reinforcement, it requires consistency. And consistency is not proven through repetition, but through behavior that does not change under pressure. When you respond once and do not chase understanding, you are not disconnecting from people, you are reconnecting with yourself. You are teaching your nervous system that peace does not come from being understood by everyone, but from no longer abandoning yourself in the process of trying to be understood. And over time, something interesting happens. People begin to adjust their perception of you. Not because you demanded it, but because your behavior removed ambiguity. You become someone whose words carry weight, not because they are frequent, but because they are final. Your presence begins to communicate that you are not easily shaken into emotional excess. And in a world where overreaction is common, calm finality stands out as authority. This is how worth is quietly communicated, not through proving, not through persuading, but through the disciplined decision to stop explaining what your consistency already demonstrates. Expend KEY.2 in 600 words, with OUT heading boundaries, are often misunderstood as statements, but in reality, they are not what you say, once they are what you demonstrate repeatedly under pressure. A spoken boundary is only the beginning. The true boundary begins when someone tests it, challenges it, ignores it, or subtly pushes against it to see whether your words carry weight. In that moment, your behavior becomes the definition of your worth in their perception. Many people set boundaries in moments of emotional clarity. They feel hurt, overwhelmed, or disrespected, and they declare what they will no longer tolerate. But the real test does not happen when the boundary is spoken. It happens later, when emotions have cooled and the same situation reappears in a slightly different form. This is where most boundaries collapse, not because they were wrong, but because they were not reinforced through consistent action. A boundary without enforcement becomes a suggestion, and suggestions are always negotiable in the eyes of others. When someone learns that your no can be softened by persistence, guilt, or emotional pressure, they may begin to see that your no is not a final answer. They do not necessarily see you as weak in a moral sense, they simply learn that your limits are flexible. And flexible limits are almost always tested again. The strength of a boundary is not measured by how firmly it is declared, but by how calmly it is maintained. There is a quiet power in refusing to over-explain why your boundary exists. You do not need to repeatedly justify your limits to make them valid. The moment you begin to over-justify, you shift from authority into negotiation. And negotiation weakens the perception of certainty. True boundaries are often quiet. They are not loud performances of self-respect. They are consistent actions that reflect it. If something crosses your limit, you respond the same way each time. Not with emotional escalation, not with long explanations, but with steady, predictable action. That consistency creates clarity in the minds of others. And clarity removes confusion, which removes testing. People naturally test inconsistency. It is human behavior. When your response changes depending on mood, exhaustion, or emotional state, others unconsciously begin to explore where the real limit is. But when your response remains stable, the testing gradually stops. Not because people become more respectful on their own, but because your behavior teaches them that testing leads nowhere. There is also an internal transformation that happens when you maintain boundaries consistently. At first, it may feel uncomfortable, especially if you are used to accommodating others to preserve harmony. You may feel tension in the silence that follows your refusal. But over time, that discomfort is replaced by something more stable: self-trust. You begin to experience yourself as someone who does not abandon their own standards for temporary approval. This is where boundaries shift from external communication to internal identity. You are no longer setting boundaries as an action, you are living as someone who naturally has them. And when boundaries become identity, you no longer need to defend them emotionally. They are simply part of how you exist. One of the deepest misunderstandings about boundaries is the belief that they create distance or conflict. In truth, weak boundaries create more chaos than strong ones. When people do not know where they stand with you, they continue to push, test, and reinterpret your behavior. But when your limits are clear and consistent, relationships become more stable, not less. There is less guessing, less tension, and less emotional confusion. Consistency also removes resentment. When you do not enforce your boundaries, you may initially maintain peace on the surface, but internally, accumulation begins. Small moments of discomfort build into silent frustration. Over time, this turns into emotional exhaustion. But when you enforce boundaries early and calmly, you prevent that accumulation. You protect your inner environment from becoming a place of silent conflict. Ultimately, a strong boundary is not about controlling others. It is about maintaining integrity with yourself across time. It is the repeated decision not to betray your own standards for temporary comfort. And every time you hold that line without aggression, without over-explanation, and without collapse, you quietly teach the world something very clear about you. Your presence is not negotiable, your values are not flexible under pressure, and your worth is not defined by how much you are willing to endure. Expend KEY.3 in 600 words with OUT heading selective availability is one of the most misunderstood forms of personal power, because many people confuse it with distance, coldness, or emotional withdrawal. In reality, it is none of those things. It is not about becoming unavailable to life or people. It is about becoming intentional with where your energy flows. And energy, when understood deeply, is not just time or attention. It is emotional presence, mental focus, and inner alignment combined into one quiet force. Most people operate from unconscious availability. They respond instantly, they engage automatically, they give attention without pause, and they make themselves accessible in ways that are driven more by habit than by choice. Over time, this creates a pattern where their presence is always assumed, and what is assumed is rarely valued with depth. Not because they lack worth, but because availability without intention slowly removes the sense of distinction. Human perception responds strongly to contrast. When something is always present, it blends into the background of experience. But when something is present by choice rather than by default, it carries weight. Selective availability introduces that contrast. It communicates, without words, that your time, attention, and emotional energy are not endlessly open resources. They are allocated consciously. This does not mean withdrawing from relationships or becoming emotionally distant. It means removing automatic access. Instead of reacting to every call for attention, you begin to pause. Instead of replying immediately out of obligation, you respond from intention. Instead of being emotionally present for everyone at all times, you begin to discern where presence is meaningful and where it is simply expected without value exchange. This shift changes how others perceive you, but more importantly, it changes how you perceive yourself. Because every time you choose where to invest your attention, you reinforce self-awareness. You are no longer operating from emotional reflex. You are operating from conscious direction. And consciousness always carries more authority than habit. There is a deeper psychological layer to this as well. When someone has unlimited access to your energy, they rarely feel the need to consider its impact. Not necessarily out of disrespect, but because human behavior adjusts to accessibility. If something is always available, urgency dissolves. But when access is no longer guaranteed, awareness increases. People begin to value presence more when it is no longer assumed. Selective availability also protects your internal state. Constant emotional openness without filtration leads to exhaustion. Every interaction, every message, every request becomes a micro drain on attention. Over time, this fragmentation weakens clarity. You begin to feel scattered, reactive, and mentally overstimulated. But when you choose where to engage, your energy consolidates. And when energy consolidates, clarity returns. There is also a quiet dignity in not being everywhere for everyone. It is not about exclusion, it is about alignment. You begin to ask a subtle but powerful question before engaging. Does this interaction deepen my life or dilute it? That question alone changes the quality of your decisions. You stop reacting to urgency and start responding to relevance. At first, people may notice the change. Some may misinterpret it as distance because they were accustomed to unrestricted access. But over time, perception shifts. They begin to recognize that your presence is not absent, it is deliberate. And deliberate presence carries more weight than constant availability ever could. What makes selective availability powerful is that it is not loud. It does not announce itself. It is communicated through patterns. Delayed responses that are not emotional reactions, engagements that feel intentional rather than automatic, and a consistent sense that your time is not fragmented by impulse. And as this pattern stabilizes, something important happens internally. You stop feeling obligated to be constantly reachable in order to maintain connection. You begin to understand that real connection does not depend on immediacy, it depends on quality. And quality requires space, attention, and discernment. In the end, selective availability is not about being less present in life. It is about being fully present where it actually matters. And when your presence becomes intentional instead of automatic, people begin to feel something different around you, not scarcity, not distance, but value. Because what is chosen is always more powerful than what is given without thought. Expend KEY.4 in 600 words with OUT heading Emotional Regulation Under Pressure is one of the clearest signals of inner maturity because it reveals whether a person is led by impulse or guided by awareness. Anyone can appear composed when life is calm, when conversations are easy, and when expectations are aligned. But worth is not revealed in comfort. It is revealed in disruption. It is revealed in moments where ego is triggered, misunderstandings arise, or external behavior challenges your internal stability. Most people think emotional control means suppressing feelings, but suppression is not regulation. Suppression is resistance that pushes emotion down without processing it, and what is unprocessed always returns in another form. True emotional regulation is not the absence of emotion, it is the presence of awareness within emotion. It is the ability to feel without being overtaken, to experience without becoming reactive, and to observe without losing center. When pressure enters a situation, the nervous system naturally wants to react quickly. It seeks release, validation, defense, or correction. This is the instinctive layer of human behavior. But emotional maturity begins the moment you create a gap between stimulus and response. In that gap, something powerful happens. You regain choice. And choice is where dignity begins. A person who reacts immediately under pressure often communicates instability, even if their words are correct, because the intensity of reaction shifts attention away from truth and toward emotion. But a person who pauses internally, even if only for a moment, communicates something different. They communicate that their state is not controlled by external triggers, and this perception changes how others respond to them. There is a subtle authority in not being emotionally pulled into chaos. It does not require dominance or force. It requires steadiness. When others escalate and you remain grounded, you naturally become the reference point in the interaction. Not because you are trying to lead, but because you are not being destabilized. Stability, in emotional environments, is rare, and what is rare becomes influential. Under pressure, many people also feel the need to immediately defend themselves. They rush to correct misunderstandings, prove intentions, or justify actions. But emotional regulation teaches a different approach. Not every moment requires immediate response. Some situations resolve more clearly when you are no longer emotionally charged. Clarity often emerges in stillness, not in reaction. This does not mean disengagement or avoidance. It means timing. It means recognizing when response will create clarity versus when response will create escalation. A regulated mind understands that silence is not weakness when it is used intentionally. It is space for thought to settle. And when thought settles, truth becomes easier to express without distortion. One of the deepest transformations that comes with emotional regulation is the loss of urgency in proving yourself. When you are emotionally reactive, you feel compelled to be understood immediately. But when you are regulated, you begin to trust that truth does not require force, it requires consistency. And consistency reveals itself over time, not in moments of tension. People often underestimate how much emotional control influences perception of worth. When someone is easily triggered, others subconsciously feel like they must manage their behavior carefully around them. There is tension in interaction. But when someone remains calm under pressure, others feel safe in their presence. That sense of safety is not passive, it is deeply influential. It creates trust without explanation. Emotional regulation also changes the relationship you have with yourself. Instead of seeing emotions as commands, you begin to see them as signals. Anger becomes information. Sadness becomes information. Frustration becomes information. None of these states are enemies, they are indicators. And when you stop identifying with them completely, you gain the ability to respond rather than be controlled. Over time, this practice builds an internal stability that is not dependent on external validation or circumstances. You stop being easily shaken by disagreement, rejection, or misunderstanding, not because you no longer care, but because your identity is no longer fragile. And when identity is stable, external chaos loses its power to define you. In the end, emotional regulation under pressure quietly teaches people something without words. It shows them that your value is not dependent on how you feel in the moment, but on how grounded you remain through it. And that grounded presence becomes a form of silent authority, one that does not need to announce itself, because it is already felt in the way you carry yourself through difficulty. Expend key point 5 in 600 words without heading. Refusing to over-explain your no is one of the most subtle yet powerful expressions of self-respect, because it reveals whether your boundaries are rooted in certainty or dependent on approval. A weak no is often surrounded by justification, emotional cushioning, and long explanations designed to reduce discomfort in the other person. But in doing so, something important is unintentionally communicated. You are not fully settled in your decision. And what is not settled within you will always be tested outside of you. When someone gives a clear no without unnecessary explanation, it can feel uncomfortable at first, both for the receiver and sometimes even for the one speaking it. This discomfort is not a sign of wrongness. It is a sign of unfamiliar clarity. Many people are conditioned to believe that refusal must be softened, that disagreement must be wrapped in politeness, and that boundaries must be emotionally negotiated to be acceptable. But in reality, over-explaining your no often shifts it from a boundary into a conversation. And once it becomes a conversation, it becomes vulnerable to influence. Every additional explanation you attach to your refusal creates an opening. Not necessarily because others are malicious, but because human nature responds to openings. If a boundary has reasons, those reasons can be debated. If it can be debated, it can be stretched. And if it can be stretched, it is no longer experienced as fixed. It becomes conditional. A strong no is not loud, defensive, or emotionally charged. It is calm, simple, and complete. It does not invite negotiation because it is not internally negotiable. This is where true authority emerges, not through force, but through clarity that does not need reinforcement. When your no stands on its own, it communicates that your decisions are not up for emotional voting. Many people over-explain because they are trying to preserve harmony. They want to avoid disappointment, tension, or rejection. So they add layers of reasoning in hopes that understanding will soften the other person's reaction. But in doing so, they often sacrifice something more important: internal alignment. Because every time you over-explain a boundary you already know is right, you slowly train yourself to prioritize comfort over truth. There is also a deeper psychological effect at play. When you repeatedly justify your no, you begin to unconsciously position yourself as someone who must be convinced of their own decisions. And when others sense this, even subtly, they may continue to engage, question, or push, not always intentionally, but because the structure of your response invites it. Where there is explanation, there is room for counter-explanation. In contrast, a clean no creates closure. It signals completion. It does not require emotional follow-up or extended discussion. And while it may feel sharp to those who are used to softened boundaries, It is actually more respectful in the long term. It removes ambiguity. It prevents misunderstanding. And it eliminates the slow erosion of your own limits through repeated negotiation. This practice also transforms your internal state. At first, saying no without explanation may trigger guilt or discomfort, especially if you are accustomed to being agreeable or accommodating. But that discomfort is not a sign that you are doing something wrong. It is a sign that you are breaking an old pattern of self-abandonment. Over time, as you remain consistent, something shifts. The guilt begins to fade, and in its place comes stability. You begin to trust your own decisions without needing external validation. And something interesting happens externally as well. People begin to adjust, not because they are being controlled, but because clarity forces recalibration. They learn that your decisions are not fragile. They learn that persistence does not dissolve your boundaries. And gradually, the need to test or push decreases. The most important transformation, however, is internal. You stop feeling the need to manage everyone's emotional response to your boundaries. You stop carrying responsibility for how others feel about your clarity. And you begin to understand that your no is not an act of rejection, it is an act of alignment. In the end, refusing to over-explain your no is not about being distant or rigid. It is about honoring your own clarity enough to let it stand without apology. Because when your boundaries no longer require justification, your life begins to reflect something much deeper. A quiet, unshakable sense of self-respect that does not collapse under the weight of external approval. Expend KEY.6 in 600 words with OUT heading consistency in identity is one of the most overlooked forms of personal power because it does not rely on intensity, emotion, or momentary inspiration. It relies on repetition. And repetition is what transforms behavior into character. Many people are able to show strength in isolated moments. They can be disciplined when motivated, confident when conditions are favorable, and emotionally controlled when life feels manageable. But these are not indicators of identity. They are indicators of fluctuation. True identity is revealed when the same standards are maintained across changing internal states. When motivation disappears, when fatigue sets in, when emotions are unsettled, when external validation is absent, do your actions remain aligned with your values, or do they collapse into inconsistency? This is where worth becomes visible, not in how high you rise in good moments, but in how stable you remain when those moments are gone. Human perception is deeply sensitive to consistency. People may not consciously analyze it, but they feel it. When someone behaves differently depending on mood, environment, or audience, it creates uncertainty. And uncertainty weakens trust, not necessarily because the person is untrustworthy in intention, but because inconsistency creates unpredictability. And unpredictability makes it difficult for others to form a stable perception of who you are. On the other hand, consistency builds psychological safety. When your behavior remains aligned over time, people begin to understand what to expect from you. And in human relationships, predictability is not boring, it is grounding. It signals reliability. It signals emotional stability. It signals that your principles are not temporary performances, but embedded structures within your character. But consistency is not only about how others perceive you. It is even more important in how you perceive yourself. Every time you act in alignment with your stated values, you reinforce self-trust. And self-trust is built quietly, through repetition, not declaration. When your actions repeatedly confirm your internal standards, you stop questioning your own direction. You stop negotiating with your discipline. You stop needing external reinforcement to stay aligned. The opposite is also true. Every time you break your own consistency, every time you act against what you know you should do, you introduce internal fragmentation. Not immediately visible, but cumulative. Over time, this creates a subtle disconnect between who you believe you are and how you actually behave. And that gap slowly weakens confidence, not in dramatic ways, but in small hesitations, delayed actions, and internal doubt. Consistency also protects you from the illusion of intensity. Intensity feels powerful in the moment. It creates emotional highs, sudden shifts, and bursts of motivation. But intensity is not stable. It burns quickly. Consistency, however, does not rely on emotional peaks. It operates even in emotional neutrality. It is not dependent on feeling ready, it functions because it is established as identity. This is why mastery in any area is never built through occasional effort. It is built through predictable repetition. The body, mind, and emotional system begin to adapt to what is consistently demanded of them. Over time, what once required effort begins to feel natural, not because it became easier, but because it became identity. There is also a deeper social effect. When people observe consistency in you, they begin to take your presence more seriously. Not because you are louder, but because you are stable. They recognize that your behavior does not shift with convenience or emotion. And in a world where inconsistency is common, stability becomes a quiet form of authority. But perhaps the most important transformation happens internally. When you become consistent in your identity, you stop living as a reaction to circumstances. You begin living as an expression of principle. Your decisions become less about how you feel in the moment and more about who you have decided to be. And that shift removes confusion. It removes internal debate. It removes the constant emotional negotiation that drains clarity. Over time, consistency becomes effortless, not because life becomes easier, but because your identity becomes settled. You no longer ask whether to act in alignment, you simply do. And in that simplicity, something powerful emerges. A quiet confidence that does not need to announce itself, because it is already evident in the steadiness of your presence across every situation.